This is Seeking Delphi, episode number 48, Space Commerce with Tess Hatch. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. On May 30th of this year, space history was made when two American astronauts were launched to the International Space Station aboard SpaceX's Dragon crew capsule. It marked the first launch of astronauts from American soil since 2011 and the first ever launch of astronauts by a private company. Increasingly, space commerce, the exploration and exploitation of space for profit by private enterprise, has become a driving force in a multiplayer space race that is accelerating progress at a pace not seen since the race to the moon that fueled the 1960s competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. What exactly is space commerce, and what does it portend for the future of space exploration? Tess Hatch is an investor in space commerce with a strong aerospace background. I spoke to her recently to discuss all these issues. Tess, welcome to Seeking Delphi, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Our subject today is going to be space commerce, something that's interested me for a long time, and I see from your background you're very interested in it, even invest in it. So give us just a couple of minutes of your background and how that ties into space commerce.
Sally Ride, the first American female astronaut, went to my childhood school. And when I went there, she came back and spoke. And I was so inspired hearing about her journey that I wanted to travel and follow in her footsteps and travel to outer space and become an astronaut. So seeing common backgrounds of astronauts, such as aerospace engineering degrees and work experience, I started embarking on that journey. It started with an internship at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where I got to witness the Curiosity Mars rover landing on the surface of Mars, nicknamed the 7 Minutes of Terror, because there was a 7-minute delay when the rover landed on the surface of Mars. And it took 7 minutes traveling at the speed of light to get back to mission control, whether it was successful or not. Continuing on to University of Michigan, where I studied aerospace engineering. After graduating, I had various work experience at SpaceX, integrating satellites with the Falcon 9 rocket, and Boeing as a structural design engineer, working on metal 3D printed pieces. And then at Stanford, getting my master's in aeronautics and astronautics engineering. So with all of this technical aerospace background, you'd think I'd still be a technical engineer. I've actually, I'm now a venture capitalist, investing in these earlier stage space companies and ideas. I'm now a vice president at Bessemer Venture Partners, where I invest in deeper frontier technology, specifically, as you can imagine, space and drones, autonomous vehicles, and things that were science fiction a few years ago that are reality today.
Let's get on to the topic of space commerce. And I think, in a way, we have to define it first. There's a kind of a multi-player space race going on right now. Several government agencies, several commercial ventures working on their own, commercial ventures working with government agencies. It's very complex. I compare that with the original space race in the 60s that I grew up with and watched John Glenn and Neil Armstrong and Alan Shepard. And I was so excited. That got me interested in science fiction. My father, who was a science fiction fan and an electrical engineer, was responsible for that and probably responsible for my becoming a futurist. But in a sense, there always was space commerce in that NASA's always used the commercial contractors just the way the Defense Department does. But it's kind of different today. So what's different? How do you define space commerce today versus what it was back in the day?
The largest difference today is the space race is among commercial companies rather than governments. And these commercial companies aren't necessarily doing it for pride or national security, but because space is a tremendous business opportunity. space is commercially lucrative and not only in the best interest of countries, but also investors and shareholders.
Let's get into some of that in greater detail. There are several players out there, and I'm curious to know which ones intrigue you the most, both on the commercial side and the government side. And to some extent, they work together, and in some extent, they do their own thing.
Rocket Lab and Spire Global are two private venture-backed space companies that are really lowering the barrier of entry to space and opening space for business. Rocket Lab is a tiny launch vehicle that deploys CubeSats, which are satellites the size of a tissue box, into space. And Rocket Lab has launched 12 rockets deploying over 50 satellites into orbit. Spire Global has the largest general purpose CubeSat constellation. CubeSats are those tissue box sized satellites with 3 sensors. Spire has an AIS sensor for maritime tracking, ADS-B sensors for aviation tracking, and GPS radial occultation sensors for weather monitoring and prediction. Now, why these companies why they intrigue me and why they're important is because historically, the only way to get an asset into space was a large school bus-sized satellite that would take years, if not decades, to design, build, test, and launch, and cost tens, hundreds, maybe more millions of dollars. And the invention of the CubeSat and the tiny launch vehicle really lowered the barrier of entry to allow one to more easily access space. Additionally, of course, SpaceX intrigues me, especially with the recent Dragon crew launch of astronaut Doug and Bob to the International Space Station. And on the government side, the Russian Soyuz launch vehicle is actually the most frequently used launch vehicle in the world, with over 1,700 flights since its debut in 1966. Now, something you mentioned was the public-private partnerships. Last month, that launch was so monumental because it proved a very successful PPP, public-private partnership, between NASA and SpaceX. Before that launch, we actually depended on that Russian Soyuz launch vehicle I mentioned to launch our astronauts into space. So not only did it prove a very successful PPP, which has already actually proved successful because SpaceX has delivered dozens of cargo resupply missions to the International Space Station, but this one was the first time since 2011 we launched Americans from a privately made American rocket from American soil. And I look forward to Doug and Bob safely returning home and us launching more astronauts to the International Space Station on a Falcon 9 from American soil.
Well, when you mentioned the small CubeSats, I'm kind of surprised you didn't link that to SpaceX, because you've got talk about a commercial venture, Elon Musk and SpaceX trying to launch, hundreds or thousands for a global satellite internet service. To me, that's pretty amazing, although I guess you maybe won't worry about all that space junk in orbit. I don't know.
The Starlink constellation, which is SpaceX's actually tens of thousands satellites in space, are aiming to provide the world with ubiquitous internet connectivity. So you can imagine the ways that we get internet at the moment. Sometimes you're not able to lay fiber optics on the floor, or there's areas of the world where it's not currently available. So bringing those areas online and all of the secondary and tertiary effects of the world being connected. Regarding the number of satellites up there and therefore space junk, space is large. There's lots of room up there. And we have ground-based systems that can track down to 2 centimeters where everything is in space. So while it is very, very important to especially avoid the orbit our International Space Station is and souls are on board, these satellites will have either active or passive propulsion. Active is a device that can move it. Passive is orienting your X, Y, or Z direction of the satellite to therefore speed up or slow down with the surface area to drag ratio. We'll be able to avoid collisions. Also, low Earth orbit, where these satellites are, is 5 to 1,200 kilometers whizzing around the Earth every 90 minutes. So the lifetime is not very long, and the second they deorbit a little bit, they'll burn up upon reentry. So personally, I don't view space junk or space debris colliding into one another as big of an issue as others do.
Let's move on to another topic that I think is very interesting. And this one is basically really a pure profit with nothing but a very expensive thrill ride. And that's space tourism. And I think is maybe Virgin Galactic is one that's in that. There may be a couple of others, and it's like, geez, it sounds exciting, but I don't have the whatever many $1,000,000 it takes to take a joyride into space, and I'm not sure I'd want to at my age. When I was younger, I would have loved to. But what's your take on that? Where do you think it's going, and where will it go in the future? Will it ever become more affordable, or are we kind of just stuck in a joyride for multimillionaires?
I do imagine a future where one travels to space with the frequency that we currently travel in an aircraft. And I definitely hope to make the trip myself someday. Space tourism, at least at the moment, is what you said, billionaires taking selfies in space. But I look forward to, in the future, when launch vehicles become more reliable and commercial applications like manufacturing in space or pharmaceutical testing in space become abundant, and as a result, lower the cost of the trip. Another thing is that space tourism has excited people about space again and will allow people's imagination to become reality, and the potential opportunity to go to space via an alternative route rather than being a NASA astronaut. Taking space tourism a step further, I believe we need to be a multi-planet species in order to survive. But this isn't to give up on Earth, but rather to solve the problems that we have here on Earth. I believe the technology needed to get to and sustain life on another planet will fix and help life back on Earth. For example, MRI and CT scanning technology, that was further developed from the Apollo mission. When we landed astronauts on the moon, we wanted to take pictures on the lunar surface. And that optic technology is being used in our hospitals, saving lives every day.
There's no question that one of the arguments that I've heard over the years is that the money invested, say, in NASA by the U.S. government has paid itself off many times over in the creation of spin-off of businesses and industries into the general population. I know it's been said that, for example, our microcomputer technology might have been accelerated by 20 years by the approach that we took to miniaturize rather than going super big the way the Russians did. And obviously our approach worked. We got there first. So that's interesting. So the space tourism is interesting to me. And that's interesting. You talked about manufacturing in space. Way back 3 years ago when I first started this podcast, I did a couple of mini casts from the Association of Professional Futurists. Annual meeting was in Seattle that year. We had a panel on space, and it was really people in space commerce. We had representatives from Boeing, and we had Chris Lewicki from Planetary Resources, since been acquired by somebody else. But there's a guy in 2017 is developing a business to mine asteroids. Talk about looking far ahead. I mean, and he's talking about not mining them initially even to bring the resources back to Earth, but to use it to provide resources to people who are doing manufacturing in space or colonizing Mars, Moon. These are a long way away. I mean, asteroid mining sounds to me like something that's a long ways away. I mean, where's it progressed in those 3 years? Are we still kind of decades away from that? What's your take on it?
There are 9,000 known asteroids currently travel in orbit close to Earth, and approximately 1,000 new ones are discovered each year. And 1 kilometer diameter asteroid can contain up to 7,500 tons of platinum with a potential value of $150 billion. So these asteroids can contain everything from water, like you said, it's useful for long-term space exploration missions, to nickel and cobalt, or even valuable metals like gold or platinum. And companies like Planetary Resources, that you mentioned your podcast, and Deep Space Industries are working on mining these asteroids. So now you may ask why we haven't mined them yet. With this $150 billion market opportunity, like, where are we at? So the difficult and pricey part actually isn't the research and development that goes into working on how to actually do the asteroid mining, nor is it actually the launches that take place to reach the asteroid. It's actually really expensive to get the materials back to Earth once we've mined them. And additionally, that's not mentioning the fact that introducing a surplus of these new precious metals on Earth would have an effect of greatly lowering its market value. Asteroid mining, in my opinion, is one of many futuristic space technologies. There's also manufacturing in space. So on Earth, we can change the temperature and pressure in various material sciences, but in space, we have a new lever of gravity. We can change and remove gravity and imagine pulling fiber optic cables, which is greatly benefited while doing in space because you pull it and there's zero imperfections. While on Earth, gravity causes imperfections. And these fiber optic cables is used in our communications. And imagine, a financial trading application, perfect fiber optic, zero latency can help that industry, billions, perhaps more. Other futuristic space technology is space debris removal. So, while I'm not as concerned, we need a solution to get rid of space junk that's causing issues. Repairing and refueling a satellite whose antenna or solar panel didn't deploy in space hurts the entire mission. The mission could be dead because of it. So having a space dumpster to take away the old satellites, but then a space doctor to help the satellites that didn't work, and then space experiences, hotels, and colonizing other planets. All of these ideas were science fiction just a few years ago, and either a reality or becoming a reality today. And I'm really looking forward to what's science fiction today that will become a reality in the future.
Well, that's the notion of manufacturing in space, and I can see, I think it's Jeff Bezos who said he'd like to see more of the heavy industry off planet because it's also saving the environment by not creating the waste, the air pollution, water pollution, toxic chemical stuff on Earth. But how far away realistically are we from doing it to a significant enough amount to put a dent in those problems? Well, I don't see it in this decade. Is it 2050? Is it 2100? Is it nobody knows?
Manufacturing has the same issue as asteroid mining. Actually doing it is the difficult part. Getting it back to Earth is the difficult part. Being a venture capitalist, I look for shorter term horizons, 5-ish year return on my investment. So asteroid mining or manufacturing in space is not on the top of that list just yet. It'll really depend on reusable, reliable launch vehicles, and specifically reusable that can return back to Earth, such that when we have transportation to and from these either space colonies or low Earth orbit space habitats or asteroids, once we have that transportation to and from, it'll become a reality. I would say more than 10 years, less than 20, but that's a wide range, maybe less than 30.
Okay, as a futurist, I have to ask that question.
Of course.
Let's talk about a few of the big players in relationship to each other. There's sort of a big three, big wallet, big ego players out there. There's Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin. There's Virgin Galactic with Richard Branson, and there's SpaceX with Elon Musk. And I'm curious to what extent, how much is this, they're climbing it because there's a mountain and it's a challenge, or they're doing it for their ego, and how much of it is profit, or is it kind of a combination of all three with these guys? Sometimes I think it is.
I don't know any of the men personally, although I wish I did. And I admire all that they have done tremendously. In some ways, I don't care why they're doing it. It's the fact that they are doing it, whether it's for financial or other reasons. Whatever the reason is, it's doing tremendous good for our world. So Blue Origin is developing the New Shepard and New Glenn, both reusable rockets that take off and land vertically and travel to suborbital and orbital space. Thus far, neither have escaped Earth's velocity. Virgin Galactic is building a Spaceship Two, which aims to provide suborbital space flights for 7 space tourists, so they're carrying people. Another subsidiary of Virgin, though, is Virgin Orbit, and that company aims to launch a rocket off of an aircraft, deploying satellites into low Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit ranges from 500 to 1,200 kilometers. And then SpaceX, as I assume many know well, launches the Falcon 9 rocket. and has launched dozens of commercial, government, and Dragon missions. Dragon is the capsule that goes to the International Space Station, either deploying cargo and last month, the first time, deploying crew, so 2 astronauts. So while Jeff made his wealth from Amazon, Richard from Virgin Records and then Virgin Group, and Elon from PayPal and then Tesla, I can't imagine these men making this type of investment if it wouldn't be as profitable as their other endeavors. And I really look forward to a woman being added to that list.
Well, who knows? Maybe that'll be you someday. We can certainly hope so. One other company to mention, because they have gotten kind of involved in a way in the race with SpaceX and others, and that's Boeing. And of course, they've had their other problems with 737 MAX, but they're more of a traditional aerospace company and have been a contractor probably to various government military groups and NASA, but they're sort of also doing their own thing in the space commerce area. And I'm wondering, they're a public company, whereas the 3 others you mentioned, although they may have public companies, their space ventures aren't. So I'm curious to know how you see a company like Boeing, a more traditional aerospace company, fitting in the whole picture.
The Boeing of today isn't the Boeing it was 20 years ago. And they have had to adapt to the incoming competition of these private companies. And like in most areas, it's always good to have competition and multiple people or companies coming up with solutions for very challenging issues. That's optimal. One big difference, like you mentioned, is the private companies that are in space don't have the same sort of short-term obligations and pressures from their shareholders, which gives them the ability to make certain longer-term investments that might be more difficult for publicly held companies. But these companies like Boeing have adapted a lot, and I believe if they continue to adapt, they'll continue to play an important and vital role in the sector.
Sounds great. Well, I certainly wish you the best of luck with all these ventures, and maybe we will see you up there running your own aerospace company someday, but I'm sure there'll be a lot more to talk about in this in the future, as the technology once again is accelerating rapidly, almost to the extent the way it was back in the 1960s, and maybe for better reasons than it was in the 1960s. So again, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
For those interested in a deeper, more detailed exploration of these topics, I recommend looking into the Ascend Conference, to be staged online from November 16th through the 18th by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Originally scheduled for Las Vegas, the event will go virtual due to the continuing coronavirus crisis. It will bring together the broad universe of players, both public and private, to provide what it describes as the launchpad to a $1 trillion space economy. Among the featured speakers are Andy Weir, author of The Martian, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, and former NASA Mars navigator Mariba Jha, who was previously heard on Seeking Delphi episode number 42. Links to conference information are available on the webpage for this program at www.seekingdelphi.com. My thanks to Interpros for arranging today's interview with Tess Hatch. My technical assistant is Mohammed Maroof. Thanks, as always, for listening. Until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.